Welcome to the Center for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. My name is Irina Schneider, and I'm your host on the Governance Podcast today. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Gillian Hadfield, who is the Richard L. and Antoinette Schamoi Kirtland Professor of Law and Professor of Economics at the University of Southern California. Dr. Hadfield studies the design of legal and dispute resolution systems in advanced and developing market economies, the markets for law, lawyers, and dispute resolution, contract law and theory, economic analysis of law, and regulation of legal markets and the legal profession. She holds a J.D. from Stanford Law School and a Ph.D. in economics from Stanford University. Her book, Rules for a Flat World, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. Gillian, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Irina. It's really wonderful to be here.
So I just want to jump right into your book. You examine some of the key challenges that social complexity is actually posing for governance these days. Could you tell us a little bit more about the book's main argument, where it came from, and can you explain the nature of these governance challenges?
Sure. Our starting point is the fact that the world is undergoing rapid transformation. The flat world in the title refers to, it's a reference to Tom Friedman's book from about a decade ago, The World is Flat, where he emphasized the development of a global collaboration platform as a result of the development of the internet and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the expansion of global markets. And in the decade since that time, or a decade or more, we've seen even more extensive, you can use the term flattening, primarily through digitization, which is about as flat as you can get. You can take objects, not yet people, but reduce them to a set of zeros and ones. And this is producing a global economy that is increasingly complex in the sense of complex adaptive systems, difficult to predict, highly responsive to small changes. It's very fast-paced. Things change very rapidly. There's a lot of fluidity. And the main point I'm making is that, first of all, our existing what I call legal infrastructure is not well adapted. It's based on the nation state. It's based on top-down, primarily politically managed lawmaking, closed professions in law, and that system is not working very well to develop the innovative ways of regulating and providing legal order that we need for a much more complex global system. So my principal point is, number one, our existing systems aren't really going to be able to meet the challenge. And we need to figure out how we are going to reinvent the ways in which we make the rules and achieve social order through law. I think that's critical for economic growth and for addressing all of our social demands for equality and dignity. And I think we need to be thinking not just about what rules we want, but how are we going to make those rules and systems work.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a little bit more detail about sort of what about the current legal infrastructure isn't working? Why are the current systems unable to handle this large amount of complexity?
So over the last couple of 100 years, we've developed a very elaborate and very effective, I like to think of it as a platform that is nation-state based. It is coherent and structured, organized. It's comprehensive, but it basically looks to, at least in theory, looks to governments to produce all of our legal rules and to organize all the rules that determine what other rules, how they work and when they're valid. And that system worked extremely well for the mass manufacturing economy, industrialization, sort of through the 20th century. But number one, it doesn't work very well once we start having productive relationships that are flying across jurisdictional boundaries. And if we have things that are happening very rapidly, it's a process that's, one, very difficult to cross those boundaries. It has trouble managing the speed and complexity of those changes. And in a sense, it just can't keep up. And it also is increasingly removed from the knowledge about what's happening kind of at the ground level. So one of the key points that I'm trying to bring attention to is the idea we need to figure out how to get our systems for producing law closer to the ground of what's actually happening.
So you have a very interesting solution that you propose. What you want to do essentially is create a new layer of organizations to regulate firms. And unlike many proposals for regulating markets, you don't simply call for extending the power of the traditional government to regulate markets. Can you explain what your solution is and how it would work?
So I call this super regulation, or in more nerdy fashion, competitive approved private regulators. And the idea here is that we need to start looking more to market mechanisms to invent new regulatory, call it technology. That doesn't mean it has to be digital. It just could be methods. Our existing technology is governments write rules, they monitor for violations, adjudicate, and impose penalties. So the principal idea here is it's very comparable to the shift we see from centrally planned economies to regulated market economies. In the centrally planned economy, government makes all of the decisions about what to produce, how to price it, where to distribute it. When we shift to a regulated market economy, we push that decision-making about what to produce and how to price it primarily into a market layer. And then we give government the role of regulating those markets. So this is like saying, okay, the legal rules and processes for achieving regulation are like other products. We would like innovation. We want to attract capital. We want to attract ideas and problem solving. So if we push this into a market so that we can have private entities that could be profit or nonprofit in the business of producing regulatory systems. Now, the way that we make sure that this is responsive to the interests of the public is we still have a role for government, but we now think of the role of government as regulating those regulators. So we say to our regulated entities, you need to choose a private regulator, but you can only choose from private regulators who have maintained an active license effectively from government, who've been approved by government. And the role of government here is to make sure that those private regulators are achieving politically set and legitimate outcomes. So if you want to think about workplace accidents, we could have governments, politically accountable bodies, establishing acceptable levels of workplace accidents. And then private regulators who are coming up with different ways of achieving those objectives and selling that service to workplaces, which are required by government to choose a regulator. So it's really just sort of moving that down and trying to get competition between private regulators to drive innovation in regulatory technology.
Okay, that's a very interesting argument. I just want to bring it down to a concrete example. Let's take the pharmaceutical industry, for example. Would you be a little bit concerned about handing over regulatory power to a for-profit set of regulators? Because let's say, giant, powerful pharmaceutical corporations are going to want to just choose the regulator that lets them earn the biggest profit margins with the loosest rules. And, won't we have a race to the bottom where consumers might actually be exposed to unsafe medications because the rules created by the for-profit regulators are actually serving the interests of the pharmaceutical companies rather than, ordinary people?
So it's really important to remember the approved part of competitive approved private regulators. So this is the licensing of the private regulators by governments. So the regulator of pharmaceuticals, for example, if this method, and I don't propose this method could solve all regulatory problems, it won't be appropriate in all settings, but let's suppose that we determine it's appropriate in the context of drugs. The provider of the private regulation is essentially facing in both directions. Yes, it's facing the pharmaceutical companies that will be, in fact, interested in choosing a regulator that helps them achieve what they have to achieve at lowest cost. So there will be that pressure. That's market pressure. But at the same time, the private regulator is also facing the government and required to demonstrate on an ongoing basis, so imagining a regulatory process with some real teeth in it, is obligated to demonstrate that the private regulator has to demonstrate that its regulatory system is in fact achieving, let's say, could be rates of injury or side effects in the drug with respect to that drug. So it's the private regulator can't just meet the needs of the regulated entity. It can't only be responsive to the interests of the regulated entity. It has to also recognize that, well, if we really did start selling that really loose, crummy regulatory system, then government's going to be auditing what happens and discover that we've allowed people or companies to sell drugs that are causing excessively high rates of bad outcomes, and they lose their license. They can no longer. So you have to be dual facing for that. It's extremely important to remember. It's actually not. Corporations are not deciding what the rules are. We're creating an independent layer of private regulators that are obligated to achieve or lose their license. They don't make money if they fail to achieve the politically set outcomes.
So these private regulators would ultimately, of course, be politically accountable. But one thing that I still kind of worry about is that, corporations, particularly powerful ones, can be very stealthy in how they kind of work through the regulatory process towards their own interests. So just to think about it a little bit more, let's take environmental protection regulation. Let's say that auto manufacturers are they're making cars and the government imposes a fuel efficiency standard of 50 miles per gallon. But, let's say the car manufacturers are going to hire the regulator that lets them meet that fuel efficiency standard. But, in exchange for sacrificing some other aspect of the car that is actually bad for the consumer or the wider society. So let's just say the regulator says, well, actually, we found a way to kind of make it easy for you to meet this fuel efficiency standard if you make your cars lighter. But then, that actually makes it easier to lose control of the car, and that increases accidents and motor vehicle deaths. So, what kind of sort of protections are there in your scheme to prevent these private regulators from creating these kind of loopholes or making these kinds of trade-offs that actually can still be detrimental for ordinary people?
So the dynamics of markets and the profit and motive and incentives, none of that goes away. I mean, these are issues we face throughout the economy today. And the only reason regulated market systems achieve what they do is because we figure out how to harness and control. Every profit-making company would love to have a monopoly, would love to cheat on what it could cheat on, would love to get away with whatever it can get away with. Yeah. That's the state of play. And the reason we have regulation is to try and control that. Now, so yeah, you're exactly right. Those auto manufacturers they're going to be looking for every opportunity, just as they are now vis-a-vis government derived regulation. So none of that goes away. That doesn't go away. It's not a magic bullet. We don't magically say, they're going to sit back and just take whatever regulatory regime is created. But what we have done is reconfigured the role of government in being an overseer of regulation to say, instead of directly, sure, the manufacturers will be pressing their private regulators to try and get, let us get away with the lighter car. But, since the outcomes have only been set in terms of fuel efficiency, we can ignore this. Well, that can happen now with manufacturers and when that rule comes in from government, right? So what you'll have to be working towards is, how does government supervise the regulators and establish what the outcomes required are in order to address. That's going to be an ongoing process as it is now. I think reconfiguring it into a market, creates the potential for there's a potential for greater transparency. If we're focused on outcomes. The manufacturers, right now, when they lobby governments and so on, it's actually very difficult for the public to monitor that, to oversee it. Think of the length in the U.S. at any rate of, 1,000-page statutes, thousands and thousands of regulations that nobody reads. How do we supervise all of that? If you now have a private regulator that's making money because it does a good job of achieving government standards, government outcomes, has incentives to have better data systems, to be able to do better, more effective monitoring. And if we're focused on outcomes, the way you just described it as, here's an outcome, miles per gallon, here's an outcome, accidents due to the weight of vehicles, I think that could be, in fact, easier for governments, more transparent for governments and the public to oversee, because we're focused on a smaller number of variables, and we're focused on a smaller number of entities. The government is regulating the private regulators. There might be, 20 car manufacturers, and globally maybe 5 private regulators, but our numbers are different. There might be thousands and thousands of auto supply part suppliers and so on. So I think that those problems don't go away. It's really important to think we're not just sort of waving a wand and saying, oh, we're going to get rid of the profit incentive and the interest of manufacturers in pressuring for whatever they can get away with. Our problem right now is that governments acting directly face tremendous difficulty overseeing against precisely that pressure.
Yeah, so in a sense, what we have now, giant corporations, hiring teams of lobbyists that will basically buy out politicians and basically write out the rules for themselves. In a sense, this is what we call state capture, and basically your system is still vulnerable to this kind of process and dynamic. But I kind of wonder, though, your system is only going to work if it's competitive, if you have lots of different kind of competing private regulators offering different services. Obviously, it would be very kind of unfair if it was just a monopoly, which is in fact what is happening now. The government is a monopoly on creating rules and regulations. But let's take, for instance, industries and tech. Let's say Google and Facebook are now required by the government to choose a private regulator, and they have to sort of comply with their rules that meet the government standards. But let's say Facebook and Google have a 90% market share in their industry. It's a very high market concentration. They're the only game in town, and they hire one regulator. But effectively, in doing that, they squeeze out the other regulators because there are just no other clients in this field. And so what happens if basically, Google and Facebook can still get to write their own rules anyway through the private regulator by squeezing out competition? How can we make sure that this market remains competitive?
So we have to, this is an additional tool in the regulatory toolbox. That's my main proposal. And we have to be, we're going to have to identify settings where, in fact, we can maintain a competitive market of regulators. If, as you just described, there's a setting where there's really only one ultimately regulated entity because they have a 90% market share, and so we can't have a competitive market of regulators because, as you pointed out, we have one regulator chosen there, then that's not a setting in which this is an appropriate form of regulation. It's just like when we do our analysis of what goods should be produced in a market and what goods should be produced as public goods. And the capacity for competition due to scale is a key consideration. That's why, we at least historically, we had, government supplied or, electricity grids or water systems and so on. You say, look, economies of scale, you only actually want one provider. You're describing a setting where we just end up, because of network externalities, thinking about those platform dynamics for a Google or a Facebook. Although I think they're probably pretty contestable, even though it doesn't seem like it today. So again, this is if we can't maintain a competitive market of regulators, no, you can't adopt this form of regulation. I do think that, and I do think the type of analysis we should be doing is like the type of analysis we do in other settings to say, is this the type of good or service that we think we can leave to markets, because markets will be reasonably competitive and we can reasonably well regulate them? Or if not, is this in that subset of goods and services that need to be publicly provided? So I kind of want to put all of our regulatory questions in that same basket, do that same kind of analysis. And absolutely, there may be some where we say, this is in the bucket of stuff that needs to be regulated directly by government because we can't maintain a competitive market or because we can't effectively regulate the private regulator.
So effectively, there's still a role for government to actually produce regulation alongside private regulators in this scheme.
Yes,
right?
I would not expect at all that this does not displace all of our mechanisms, all of our regulation into this model. But I think it's a really important model to be thinking about as we look ahead, or even today, to the real challenges of regulating autonomous vehicle traffic, certain forms of artificial intelligence, the types of things, or even global supply chains. We have a tremendous amount of regulation that's happening right now through second-party regulation that really is corporations regulating themselves. Most corporations operating on a global scale are extensively involved in standard setting, bodies, in the development of codes of conduct through global supply chain contracts. There's lots and lots of our rules currently being produced by our corporations and private entities, but they're doing, they're regulating themselves. So I kind of want to say, okay, we know that in these really new areas, cybersecurity, really tremendously distributed production systems, those companies are already saying we need something different from what we're getting out of sort of the conventional methods of regulation. And so I think, that's a place to start, is to think, okay, think about the pressures to develop, to say, where is our existing systems performing least well? But no, I would not expect that everything would end up in that model.
No, I think that's actually one of the more interesting parts of the book and your argument. You want to sort of get rid of the asymmetries of power in the regulatory process between sort of large corporations who get to write their own rules and ordinary people who actually have to sort of comply with these standards, and they actually could get hurt in the process. So I kind of wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the aspect of inclusiveness in your scheme. So you talk a lot about how the current legal infrastructure is very much prohibitively costly, and most people get very little legal help, and the process of transacting often takes absolutely forever. So how would your system actually give ordinary people more access to the legal system and better legal services?
Yeah, so we've emphasized part of the proposal that I make in the book, which is that, can we develop regulated markets for rules? But I also talk about opening up our markets for access to legal services, because currently we have very, very closed systems throughout most of the world, which has also meant that the products of legal services, and that includes not just representational services, but also the drafting of contracts and the design of policies and a lot of that legal material, most of which has become phenomenally expensive and complex. So think about the terms of service that people are clicking to agree constantly online. Long, complex. Nobody reads them. Nobody could read them. I think there's been estimates if it would take you 40 hours a week to read every privacy policy that you're probably clicking agreement to.
That's true.
On a daily basis. So nobody could. So those are rules being written by the companies that will be regulated by those rules. And those are terribly important, some of those. They're about privacy. There's about security, data security. We're not getting innovation in how do we manage that. So I think, number one, your point about inclusiveness is that, the vast majority of ordinary people are forced to be completely passive about the rules governing their lives. They really just don't have a choice. The insurance policy, the terms of service, there's lots of complexity in that way. And if we introduce, like I say, this layer of the providers of regulation, and that could be private providers of contracting terms or online relationship management, because it doesn't have to be through contract, then I think there's a capacity for people to end up, one, understanding more about what the rules are, having more choice about what rules they're under. And, if we have suppose we have a global market in regulators of workplace safety. And let's suppose that operating on a global scale, we're able to say there's sufficient scale for each of those regulators for it to be effective, for them to be competitive. Conceivably, groups at a much lower level of aggregation than the nation state or even the state, or maybe even at the level of the city, could potentially be choosing which of these regulatory regimes they want to be under. Obviously there'll be incentive, there'll be pressure the other way from the companies that want to be regulated by a single regulator. But it doesn't mean that the whole world has to be under the same set of regulations. There could be differentiation, there could be choice. So I think there's a capacity for participation in this process to be really pushed closer to ordinary people and smaller scale groups. And I think that's really critical. I think one of the things we're observing in the world is a lot of people saying, wow, those rules are being written off there in Brussels or Washington, D.C., and what have they got to do with me? And Google and Facebook and so on, they're sitting down and figuring out what they want all the rules to look like. But, what happened? I'm not participating anymore. I have no say anymore. And that's been a tremendous change in human societies. The long history of human organizations and social groups is, we've kind of figured out our rules at a very local level. Tremendous challenge to figure out how can we continue to have local participation and that local sense of inclusiveness. I matter. I'm important. People are paying attention to my needs. When at the same time we're looking at, this global scale of economic activity. I think it's a real challenge. We can't just continue to say, well, keep moving the locus of rulemaking further and further away. And as it becomes more complex, we need more experts. Fewer and fewer people can really understand what goes on with cybersecurity or what goes on with drug regulation. I think it's a major challenge that we need to be thinking about how to address it. I have some ideas about how to do it. I really think it's much more important that we be recognizing that we can't just continue to expect we've got a solution in our existing legal infrastructure.
That's a really important point, particularly in this day and age. And I kind of wonder, though, there are different ways of increasing participation, popular participation in the rulemaking process. And your solution is very much market-driven. But why don't we have, let's say, a deliberative democracy revolution instead? Why is the market better at serving the interests of the many rather than the few? So, let's say, what if we had local councils or cooperatives deciding on regulation rather than handing that power over to what would inevitably be powerful corporations?
Well, I think we do have, we certainly, this isn't an either or, it's, both and. So I think, more deliberative councils, local councils. I think the history of that says that most people don't want to spend their evenings and weekends, going to meetings and regulation and so on, but they might be willing to, for example, spend some time. So let's think about an example here of privacy policies and data. How your data is treated when you sign up on a website. So right now, all of that regulation happens through a combination of complex terms that are written by the entity you're trying to control, or complex regulation that's generated through political bodies, potentially at a level very, very far removed from the local individual. It could be at the national level, the European level, even at the global level. As we try to get global, we try to harmonize across all of that. Well, let's suppose that we now had a market for that regulatory service, and we said to companies they had to choose a regulator. And now let's imagine that those different regulators, they come up with different packages of how data will be treated on a website. And now they want to actually convince consumers, ordinary people, to use their system, to sign on to a website that's got the Schneider rules or whatever. Mm-hmm. So if you're operating that company, you have an incentive to design an user-friendly, easy-to-understand system.
No 40-page terms of contract.
No 40-page. You've got 6 icons. You've got little videos or virtual reality scenarios, vignettes to explain. You have internalized the idea that more complexity, even in a complex environment, doesn't always achieve better results.
Right.
You have the checklist mentality. This is Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto. It's wonderful. But the idea that sometimes less is more, a simpler set of rules can achieve greater efficacy. You have an incentive to educate people about that and to make your educating of them entertaining, to do advertising that's entertaining, to draw them into a website, and because you can make money, for every consumer who's willing to sign up with your system, you have an incentive to invest in figuring out what's the right combination, the right balance of constraint and outcome. So you have an incentive to invest in how can I best get this message across to people. So I think we all feel a certain amount of autonomy that we can decide as we look at what phones to choose, what computers to buy, what televisions or appliances in our homes. We have a sense of I can go figure that out, and so I actually think that's the capacity for ordinary individuals to in fact learn more and be able to control more about the rules that are governing them. Right now they have very, very little control at all.
You actually run a legal hackathon at USC, right? And you actually encourage more innovation in this field from young people and people in the field in general. So actually, it's very difficult, to disrupt the legal infrastructure that we have now. And a lot of the changes that we might want to make are very difficult and slow moving. So how do you actually encourage people to innovate? Do you have any concrete examples of innovative ideas in the legal field for how to make rulemaking and transacting more agile and fluid?
Yeah, so I run something called the Legal Design Lab at USC, University of Southern California. I run this with my husband, Dan Ryan, who's a professor of innovation. And what we do is we come into that class, that lab, and we learn about the problems, and we teach people some basic design thinking and innovation tools, and encourage students, for the assignment for the semester is come up with some way of doing something. I've been teaching this for about 6 years now. First started teaching it at Harvard in 2012, and we've seen some really creative stuff. I mean, my primary goal is to get people in legal education thinking more creatively, to say, there's one rule in the lab, and that is our solution can't be change the law in this way. We've got lots of thinking about how we could change the law to solve a problem. But we have people who have worked on, apps for your phone that can take a picture of a document, like a notice to appear or a subpoena or a eviction notice, and send people simple, easy to understand information about what's happening. We've had people working on the development of blockchain-based identity systems for people in poor developing countries. I spent a whole semester working on global supply challenges and thinking about the development of a platform that would allow small traders in, say India or China or Africa or throughout the world who are largely disconnected from the global economy to be able to enter into transactions, supply T-shirts or small goods or something to entrepreneurs or companies throughout the developed world. So we've all had all kinds of neat stuff there. There's lots that's happening out there right now. I was just reading this morning about, actually it's a city now. So there are some of these apps that allow you to manage your ticket. If you've got a municipal fine or a traffic ticket, to be able to manage it with an app on your phone. And there's now some cities that have introduced this. So dispute resolution mechanisms. There's some really innovative stuff on platforms for dispute resolution that don't require you to go through courts and lawyers to manage disputes with a contractor or with your physician. So there's definitely things that are bubbling up. The key thing to remember is that at the end of the day, this is not complicated stuff, in the sense that what we're trying to do is create an environment in which people feel confidence and trust, safety, and fairness. And there's lots of ways to be creative about how to get people to feel that way. If you're starting up a little startup yourself, you and your partner want to feel confidence that I said I would do this, you said you would do that, we agreed that we were going to try and accomplish this, and here's how we planned on sharing the costs, the risks, the benefits of this endeavor. You don't necessarily need a 25-page agreement to do that, but you need something that helps you to manage that relationship. So I think we're seeing some pretty exciting stuff. I'd love to see more of it.
That is very interesting. And one of the more intriguing points you just mentioned here is the implications of more legal innovation for the developing world. And you talk about this in the book, the implications for the bottom of the pyramid. So most of the world is actually living without the rule of law, and many ordinary people don't have that kind of confidence and trust and security from the rule system in which they live. So how can more legal innovation and these sort of more decentralized ways of creating rules help people in the developing world?
So I think this is really critical because basic legal infrastructure is missing from large parts of the world. And often when we think about what are the legal challenges throughout the world, we're focused, those of us in the developed world are, heavily focused on, important things about human rights and how people are treated. And that's quite critical. But it's very top down. What we don't pay enough attention to is the absence of just basic tools to manage family relationships, to manage land disputes, to engage in contracting, to protect property, to achieve security, so that if you decide to, buy a bicycle so that you can do deliveries throughout, beyond your village, that you'll be safe in doing so. Oh, and by the way, is there any system that if you bought that bicycle and it was a lemon, you can do something? There's wonderful sets of legal needs surveys that an organization I'm affiliated with in The Hague called the Hague Institute for the innovation of law. They do legal needs surveys around the globe. And that's the information that comes back from those surveys. These are the kinds of concerns that are preoccupying people around the world. And to the extent that what we say is those poor and developing countries have to build elaborate government-based systems in order to provide people at the local level with a secure way of ensuring that they've entered into a contract that will be enforceable, or their property right will be protected in their market stall or in their home. If we require that, because we say that's what law is, it is the product of a stable, reliable government, then you put them into a catch-22, because those are expensive. Governments like that are expensive to run. And law like that is expensive to produce. So what I'd love to see is the capacity for profit or nonprofit organizations to say, we've now got mobile phones through a lot of, say, parts of Africa, text-based phones, certainly, not yet smartphones everywhere. Why can't I develop a company that's going to provide a simple mechanism for contracting over a phone and provide a simple mechanism of dispute resolution? Develop a simple set of rules. Yeah, we're going to lose all the bells and whistles, but a simple basic system that works, just like that SMS phone, so that people can register their agreements and then can have recourse to some simple mechanism. It might be technology. It might be that I actually, I have an agent in all of these locations where people can bring and say, here's the photograph of what I've got, or here's the goods that I received. Simple dispute resolution like that. I think, the history of the development of these legal tools and mechanisms in Europe, through sort of the origins of commercial law, was very much a bottom-up, different group saying, here's a way we'll organize this. And I think we've actually choked that off, that kind of let's solve our problem this way thinking at the ground level, because we've come in and said, law is this thing that these governments that are recognized by the international state system do. Mm-hmm. And so people kind of fall down dead and say, well, I guess we got to wait for the government to do it. And I say, well, no, let's figure out how we're going to do it at the local level. It's, I think there are ways to do that, and we need to really try to foster that kind of creativity and problem solving.
Just along that line, one of the things that your work actually reminds me of is some of the debates about metropolitan governance back in the 1960s in the U.S. So actually, at the time, many scholars believed that if you look at city governance, that cities are these kind of uniform, single administrative units, and they have to be governed from one center. So in reality, of course, it turns out that cities are governed at multiple levels of governance, from the federal to the state to the city to the district level to the county. And a lot of these different governments oversee some of the same problems and coordinate some of the same solutions. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they compete with each other. So at the time, this was seen as chaotic, this kind of overlapping mess of jurisdictions and rules for governing cities. And then Elinor Ostrom came on the scene, and she began studying policing behavior in cities. And she found out that crime was actually reduced the most in cities where you had lots of different levels of policing at different parts of the government, rather than in places where you just have one department overseeing policing for the entire city. And so basically, of course, Elinor ended up being the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on governing the commons. But her broader contribution is very much about letting more people and organizations partake in the rulemaking to solve everyday coordination problems. Do you see parallels between this kind of work and what you're doing?
Oh, absolutely. Ostrom's work is, groundbreaking in bringing our attention to, in a way, away from the theory that says, we've got our economic theory that says, there's, free rider problems, public goods problems. You have to have, I guess a government solution to that. And to, focus our attention on what actually happens when people are facing these kinds of problems. Well, they start talking and they figure out, let's try this, let's do that. And that there can be a diversity of solutions to that. Now, this is not about being anti-government. There's nothing ideological that's driving, Lynn Ostrom's focus on this, or I talk about markets, but it really is just about that point to say problem solving happens best close to where the problem is. And this is what we've learned all the way through our corporate organizations. This is why we've moved from substantially vertically integrated, massive organizations to much more networked systems that try to push problem solving closer to where the problems are. Let the specialists in that small part in the automobile figure out how to build it better, rather than having the original equipment manufacturer, the Ford or the Toyota, decide top down what all the specs should be for every single part. And that's been a significant source of the growth and innovation we've experienced over the last several decades. So I think it's a lesson we have to bring to the process of figuring out the rules and the technologies that work to help a community figure out what's the right balance in our policing approach, what's the right way to manage, what's happening at these local levels. It's true that, lawyers are bad for this as well, in the sense that we look at that and say, oh my gosh, it's so confusing and conflicted, and let's get everybody under a single set of rules so we can understand it. And we say, well, that's not actually working well to produce solutions at the ground level. And we can't let our theory of the way government works or governance works, or even markets work, blind us to the fact that, well, sometimes, what you really need to do is just let things bubble around at the level at which people are living, and let those, and then let the feedback come up, like you say, with Ostrom's work on policing. Oh, it turns out that, that chaotic looking mess, it produces better outcomes for people. And at the end of the day, that's all we should be worried about, is what's going to produce better outcomes for people.
Right, absolutely. It's not really we don't really face a choice between markets and states, as she says. So essentially, it's really more about solving problems and what kinds of institutions and governance mechanisms, both market-like and state-like, can actually help us solve those problems.
Yes. Yeah.
I want to end on a kind of broader piece of advice that you might have for students of law, politics, and economics who are graduating and entering this world of zeros and ones. We're going to have to manage the world of digitization, and we're constantly, increasingly intersecting with tech. I wanted to see, do you have any advice about how young people should be sort of helping disrupt slow-moving and opaque institutions? What can they do?
So I think that our students in the social sciences, I want to encourage them to be thinking a lot more like the students in the sciences or in the tech fields, in the sense of, an audaciousness about, we don't have to do it the way it's always been done. I can come up with a better way of thinking about this. Of course, we have to then go test our ideas. Not every idea is great, and some of them are pretty bad. But I think we need that kind of energy and a willingness to rethink, well, wait a second, what's our real problem here? What are we trying to accomplish? And to remove the blinders of, law is produced by governments. and policy is produced in political bodies in these ways. And say, well, wait a second, what we're really trying to do is achieve greater safety on the streets in the city. So what are the other ways that we can think about doing that to really take on the obligation of young people in those fields to invent the new ways to do this? We clearly are at a moment in history where we need reinvention of that. And the place that will come from is, young people who are thinking, okay, I want to do something more than recapitulate, what the great writers of the 18th and the 19th and even the 20th centuries thought about these problems. Mm-hmm. What are the new ideas? Human history of law and politics is tremendously diverse and dynamic. Mm-hmm. I think our ideas about it have become so powerful that we're not thinking in the kind of fresh ways that we need to. So I would hope that this generation of students in law, politics, economics is saying, okay, what are the new ideas that we can come up with?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gillian. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Great. Thanks, Irina.
To all our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation with us today. You'll be able to find more podcasts, live talks, seminars, and blogs on the cutting-edge debates on governance directly on our website, which is csgs.kcl.ac.uk. We look forward to seeing you again soon on the Governance Podcast.